Hi everyone, welcome to the world of EdCraft. This work is a collaboration with two colleagues, Andrew Lowe, the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor of Finance at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and Brian Stevens, Senior Lecturer of Business Analytics and Statistics at the Haslam College of Business, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm Sean. I'm the Haslam Chair in Supply Chain Analytics at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Andrew and Brian have already posted videos just documenting their studios and experiences. Those are linked below. This is my fourth of 6 videos documenting my studio and its experience. And my main goal for today's session is to share 4 things. And it's really what a typical class looks like, in this format. So I want to show the format of the courses that have been taught in the studio. I want to contrast that with what's done on campus, document the class logistics, and share some student feedback from this experience. So with that, let's go over to the Lightboard and dig into more details. So I have taught 2 different classes in this studio, and the first was the Introduction to Operations Management class. Second was the Supply Chain Analytics class. These are both graduate level courses that are in pretty much any top business school is offering courses of this type. And these courses have 25 to 50 students. They are both case-based classes, and what that means is that over the 24 class sessions, there are 3 to 4 major themes. And in each major theme has a model. So you could think of it as each major theme sort of has one lecture that's on a model. And then a series of the class sessions extend that model. So what we're doing in this is we are presenting sort of an initial model, and then we expand that model, enhance that model. We fully expect that students will contribute in every class. With only 50 students on campus, we would fully expect that every class session, at least 40 plus students would be participating. The focus here is on how to solve these problems in practice and how to really solve problems. So what we're doing when we're doing that is we're taking this model and we're showing how to use it in practice. And I would say the core teaching challenge to resolve is one where we need to foster but then resolve ambiguity. And what do I mean by that? Well, when students begin this journey, they think that the most important thing is the model. Right? So I mentioned at the start that every sort of major theme in the course is going to have a model. Well, students come into this experience thinking that it's the model that matters. It's the math behind the model. And that's what they want to focus on. But in reality, what we have to do is disabuse them of that notion, because the model is just one piece of what we have to do to solve a problem. In particular, there is first of all, there's like a series of models, right? It's not just like one monolithic solution that can solve everything, but we have to be able to take the base model and enhance it. Further, there's, the model is one piece of this longer journey. And I like to say, we're taking a journey from data to information, processed data, to the model, which we can then solve. We gain knowledge, which is that we as the analysts sort of now understand something from the model. From that, we can produce wisdom, which is knowledge that we can share with others to actually get them to change their behavior and decisions. If we do this long enough and with enough practice and we get good at it, then we can close the loop and achieve enlightenment, where we can actually use that wisdom to better pick future problems, better pick data that we need, and sort of start to produce a much more virtuous cycle. So that is the goal. That's what we want to get to. How do we actually do it? Well, this is one example. So that model at the top is actually a very straightforward inventory model known as a base stock model. and the dynamics of it are here. And that would be the model that we would teach as an initial theme. And then we would augment that model, build out that model in several different ways with specific cases on each class session. So in particular, we'd show how that model applies to a consumer packaged goods company. We'd show how it works for a two-tier distribution system. We'd show how you can use it to optimize service levels, how you can then use that model, you can extend that model to look at multiple sourcing methods, if you postpone the product's point of differentiation, and finally for supply chain design. So we take this base model and we use it several different ways, right? That's an example of what we're going to do in these kinds of courses via the case method. Now, how do we actually make it work? And the key on campus is to be immersed in the moment. So what we have to do if we're going to get students to sort of exercise these models, learn how to use these models, we have to get them to want to, and we get them to need to take ownership of the model, right? Of the problem and its solution. And so it's not that they're sitting there saying, they're looking at the case in some antiseptic way, and it's like, this is the protagonist, and how do I want to think about it? It's like, no, you're the protagonist. Like, if you were the protagonist, what would you do, right? So it's not this arm's length kind of thing. It's like, you are the person. What would you do, right? So you got to own the problem. You, though, still, with that ownership, you actually have to stay within the constraints of the case. You can't want to sort of quote unquote solve it so badly that you move out of the sort of rules of the case, right? So we have to stay within the case. We have to be then committed to the case. We also have to be committed to everyone else's answer to the case as we're moving through it, because they would be like the colleagues that we're trying to convince, to take our path forward. So we got to produce a joint solution with everyone. Because of that, it's a shared experience, right? This isn't something we're doing in a vacuum. We're going to do this with all of us and reach a common agreement on what are the pros and cons of different ways to move forward. There has to be a willingness and actually a sort of a receptivity to bog down in the details, to not gloss over things we don't understand. We actually need this for a lot of reasons, but for today's thing, what I'll highlight is we need it because we need people, if they don't understand the model, right, like the core thing of what the theme of this section of the course was, then they need to stop us. Because otherwise, since we're building on it in other sessions, they're just going to be lost. We also have to bog down in the details because we have to understand how do we actually use the model, right? So we have to have a willingness to dive in, work through all the details, but stop if there's a problem. Because of this, the progression on any one day is not linear. I think that's why most of us love to teach this case method. It is, I like to think of it like it's a choose your own adventure, right? And when I say choose your own adventure, I mean the class will choose the adventure. So we're all going to start in one place, but we're going to end in one of a few potential places. Now, that it's not as free-form as it sounds, and again, so don't have time to cover this today, but I would say a good instructor doesn't dictate what happens in any one class, but certainly for the overall session, make sure sort of what was covered. So there are definitely some tricks that need to be employed, but it's fair to say that still in class, it is a very dynamic process that is not preordained at the start. There's dominant modes through, but there are different modes that the class could choose to take in any given year, and that's what makes it so exciting. To sort of make clear what has to change when we move online, there actually are many things, and they're outlined here. So the first is I actually had to reallocate class time. I had to change the way that I sort of allocated time blocks versus the on-campus course. I also had to lead with the model discussion. So not only did I actually have to change the sort of allocated times, I had to change the order that I did some things. I then also needed to post solution materials before class, something I never did before when I was on campus. I had to switch scenes really rapidly when I was at the talking head station, and I'll show an example of that later. The TA has an incredibly important role, and honestly a different role than versus on campus. Here, the TA is really the air traffic controller. I'm trying to keep all of my parts going, but what the TA is doing is just of critical importance. And the TA is the one who is the gatekeeper for when students can speak or not. So students raise their hand. The TA is the one who tracks who speaks, who gets passed over, who I cut off, to sort of keep us moving. All of these things where in this format, I don't have time. I could, of course, go back and look at the video, but that would make this then a huge time commitment. So the TA is really the one that is doing that, and that's an incredibly important piece of the success of this format. And then finally, I have an after-class Zoom session that I do that's also a difference. To just dive straight into the how does the class schedule change. So what you see here, this is a typical class schedule that I follow on campus. So typically, class is 80 minutes. There's 5 minutes of class administration. So the parentheses here are the minutes. So there's 5 minutes of class administration at the start. I usually do a mini exercise, which is 8 minutes. And it's a bit of an icebreaker, get some good energy in the class, but it usually ties whatever model we're working on to current events. So they can see sort of that it's not just these cases that have been written, but we can also apply this to our current problems today. Then we dive into the case discussion. And that usually begins in a quite structured way where there's an issue identification, problem definition, and then we start to create information from the data. So there's a lot of data in the case. We extract the information from it. From there, we define the model. What are we actually looking to solve here? How do we solve it is the model solution approach. And then we jump into different scenarios with the model as well as recommendations. Somewhere along the way, because of course all classes sessions have an ebb and a flow, we sometimes I get a sense like that energy's a little low, or maybe that there's confusion, but people for some reason don't seem willing to raise it. So I usually at some point in the class have 2 30-second what I call tangents. But sometimes they're very focused, like we'll do it right early on in the class, and it would be like, okay, you're the protagonist, what would you do on Monday? Other times if people look confused, I'll be like, talk to the person next to you, why is this confusing? Whatever we're working on. Or what's unclear about this graph, or what was the most important thing, what was the most important piece of data that you found in the case, or there's all sorts of of these sort of icebreaker things, and then we'll come back as a group and take a few of those in rapid fire fashion to sort of make sure that we're back to that point where there's consensus, and we're also building up some more energy and momentum. So how does the online class differ from that? Well, it actually differs in a lot of ways. First, I actually have to spend a lot more time on class administration. I actually spend about 10 minutes on class administration. While that might sound crazy, relative to 5, what I have found is online, when we're together, there's this shared experience. When we're online, there's a shared experience, but it's not quite the same shared experience. And in particular, there are facets that are still very individual for the students. And I'm trying to pull them together, right? I'm trying to get us a common worldview on how to solve this problem, an agreement on that. So there are some things I have to do sort of at the beginning, I think, to help build that consensus. I also think because we're not all in the room and you sort of don't have the same energy, that you need to over-communicate things. So I do that at the beginning. I also spend more time on the mini exercise. That's partly just due to some of the inherent inefficiencies of Zoom rooms starting up, sort of breakout rooms and the like. But but I break people into breakout rooms and we do that there. Because I've taken more time there, I have to take some time. So we spend a little less time, probably about 6 minutes less on average, on the case itself. What happens? Well, we do a couple things. First thing is I actually added something that we don't have in the on the on-campus class, which is I break people up into pairs. So we have Zoom do this randomly. If you've already watched Andrew Lowe's video, you know that he actually has a different approach where he actually allocates more time, has a more structured group setting, so that all the different students can have sort of maximize their interactions across the semester. That's just brilliant. And I'm going to steal that myself next class I teach, but I'm sharing here what I did, not what I'm going to do. And what I did, and I don't think it's as good, but I think it actually does some interesting things, valuable things, and so this might still be valuable to you, is that I broke people off into pairs and I sent them off for 3 minutes. And I gave them a traditional task like that I used to do on the on-campus thing, like say what you all think the issue is and what was the biggest source of uncertainty you had in your solution approach or something, to try to get the sort of creative juices flowing with where we're going to be going. I then pull them back and do the issue identification like in a minute. So we blitz through this part. That earlier I would say, when I'm on campus, I try to actually sort of intentionally slow down on that. Here, because of what we're going to get to later, I actually sort of jump through this. And so with that, I don't do the problem definition really. If anything, what we used to call model definition, I now call model explanation. And what I mean by that is I actually speak more than I would like to at this point. But we take the issue identification and then I basically advance the plot. So whereas we would tease out some of those things on campus, I just actually blitz through that part here. And what that gets us to then is the model explanation. So then the students can dive into a more guided model solution. And from there, we then go back and say, like, what information did we actually need? So again, in the previous approach, we started with what was the information that you found relevant? What data did you convert to information in the case? We're now doing that sort of after we've presented the model, right? So in effect, we've sort of gone a little bit backwards here. And then we spend the same amount of time on scenario analysis and recommendations. Instead of my 2 30-second tangents, there's 1 60-second tangent somewhere in the course. I have to admit, as the course progressed, I started to somewhat plan these in, but I still called an audible if necessary. So let's see this in action. And in particular, this is one of my favorite cases. So this is managing orthopedics at Rittenhouse Medical. This is a Harvard Business case on a orthopedic surgeon and their sort of obsessive operations approach and sort of focus on quality and minimizing time and variability. And what I'm showing here on campus, I would get to this at about the 30-minute mark. So this of the case session. So this is a Gantt chart where each block is a 5-minute chunk of time. The surgeon is in control of 2 operating rooms for a 5-hour window. And what this is showing is how time is allocated and used over those 5 hours. And we're not going to get to go through the whole thing in this video, but what we can see, what's sort of worth pointing out, is the yellow is the preoperative time, when the surgeon is not in the room. The green is when the surgeon is operating on the patient. So we can actually sort of quickly see here that there's 8 patients that will be operated on in the base case. And so on campus, I teach this, and at the 30-minute mark, where we've sort of wrestled with some of these issues about why is the surgeon so focused on time, we now start to make it concrete by showing this Gantt chart. At about the 50-minute mark, I actually show this Gantt chart, and I show them in this stacked way. And this is not what is going on in the case, but this is if the 30-minute preoperative time didn't take 30 minutes, but it took 45 minutes. Because by this point in the time, there's a set of students who still just don't believe this part matters. They think, hey, if, 30, like, why is the surgeon being so obsessed about this? If it was a little longer, it wouldn't be a big deal. Here, of course, is a sort of a typical faculty trap we pull them into. The move from 30 to 45 doesn't sound like that big of a deal when you think that it doesn't involve the surgeon, or at least that's what a set of the students think. But you can very quickly show that this is a really big deal. Partly what you see is that there's actually a lot less green. We've gone from 8 patients being served to 6 patients. And we use a simple capacity model. So the underlying this for this sort of part of the course is a very simple capacity model. But what we can show is that utilization for this 45-minute scenario has dropped from like 89% to 81%. Again, students might think, hey, that's not a big deal. But once you show them that the surgeon has dropped from the 60s to the 50s of utilization, and that the number of patients served has dropped by 25%, the wheels start to turn for the people who thought, hey, this wasn't a big deal, and they start to see it is. So online, I do this totally differently. Online, I present this within 5 minutes of us beginning, and I go straight to this. So we present the first version, the top case we present, and we have so I initially, lead with this part of the model. And I then task the students to explain it, like what is going on in this, right? So the way to think about this is we still have many of the same benefits of the case method, but it's fair to say, whereas it's a little more free form in the on campus, here we have sort of more guardrails, is the way I'd say it. There still is ways to zig and zag with this, but I've sort of thrown down the gauntlet that like this is the first way we're going to approach the problem and think about it. The good of doing this is it allows the students to bog down still. It still allows them to wrestle with what's going on and think about, is this the right way to think about the problem? But it is admittedly, again, less sort of free form. So this was a major stress for me, honestly, but this was the approach I came up with to achieve many of the same benefits, I thought, but in a way that pulled the group together, sort of still met our initial objectives, but then let them dig into the details in a way where everyone was, I'd say I was sort of more like herding cats, where we were sort of flowing through the right approach. So with that, let's now see how the other sort of changes I needed to make to support this. So with regard to the changes that we've had to make for the online course, what we've shown at this point is that class time had to be reallocated, had to lead with the model discussion. Now we have to get to the other changes that were part of the online switch. So the next one, which also might seem initially controversial, is that I need to post the solution materials before class. I'll touch on this again with in the next video where I talk about learnings, but this is primarily due to the way that Zoom sort of downscales video. What you're seeing here is very clear, but students, in a big class do not see it as clearly. So in particular, what we had to show, this is an example of a class's, the analysis I do. I post this now before class. So to me, this is somewhat similar to in my previous example of showing the Gantt chart early. The other piece is now we actually share this analysis early. And this gives people the opportunity to walk through the analysis in the actual calculations and not getting bogged down on sort of then the fuzziness of any of the video. So this was an important change that was also made. I end up switching scenes a lot as I'm doing right now to try to keep things dynamic. I had a rule that I would try to change scenes like every 2 minutes, but it became second nature quite quickly. I've already mentioned the importance of the TA as an air traffic controller. It's worth repeating that, just in the sense that there are a lot of things in this format that, I think one of the biggest things we lose in the online format is this notion of sort of reading the room, right? And in particular, as we're going through content on campus, we both speed up and slow down, depending on how students are reacting to the material. So when I say that, students need to bog down in the material, it's partly that we know when that needs to be done because we can see it. It's not impossible to see here, and one of the nice luxuries of my studio is I look at the students on an 82-inch monitor, and so each student is about 5 by 7, and so you can actually see a fair amount of detail there, but of course it's not totally the same. So there's this sort of ebb and flow of the course that's harder to see. It's also the case that I can't let people go on. I have to sort of cut people off a little more than on campus, or at least a little more natural on campus. And also when you do it on campus, you know exactly who they are. As they're leaving that day, you're like, hey, that wasn't a big deal. Here, people just sign off. So it's much harder to handle that properly. The TA is invaluable because the TA is the one actually keeping a list of, hey, we cut that person off. Hey, someone raised their hand twice, but we just didn't get to them. And what the TA does in my class, where I'm so unbelievably fortunate, the TA would actually write an email to each of these people, copy me on it, and then I would follow up as well. So it was a nice way I'd say, to generate some community in that part of the process. Finally, with regards to that, after class, I would go to a different Zoom room. So I didn't want to stay in the class because other people actually stayed in the class. So what happened? So this now sort of getting into the logistics of the course. So we started class 1 hour early. We followed a checklist. I'll get to that in a second. We then taught the class. I would go to the after-class Zoom room. So the TA would stay in the course, in the class, in the Zoom session, and be available if there were any sort of administrative issues. But I left immediately because if I didn't leave, what we found is that students stuck around. So what I told the students is, hey, think about this just like you do the end of class. If you were going to walk down and say something to me, after class, just jump over to the Zoom room, and so everyone has, my personal Zoom meeting, and they would just jump into that. If they didn't want to, of course, no obligation, and they didn't have to. Typically, that lasted for about 15 to 30 minutes. The one exception is in certain times of the year, if our classes were stacked, like that the next class started in 20 minutes, then I wouldn't go past the 20-minute mark. So those were some of the details that we had. Any of the materials that got modified, anything that I scanned, or anything that we changed in Excel, all of those things immediately got posted to Canvas after the class. So just to give a very specific example of this, this is an example of the materials that I shared and created in one of the class sessions that was taught online. So this was the first document that was shared that day. So this is in the class administration part. This was our process by which people would raise hands and be selected. Then I did some over communicating about a midterm review session and some other details. Then they were about to have a major case, the National Cranberry case. So again, I gave a little more detail on that case. And then I gave a lecture. As that lecture was going on, there were a few things about capacity strategy, a few things about queuing, and those were all handled. So right when class ended, after the after class Zoom session, scanned these, uploaded them to Canvas. Right, that was the path for that day. Now, the only other detail, and I'm going to talk more about this when I get to the next video with learnings, but I will say I did follow an easy to describe but detailed set of just sort of a checklist I had to follow every class to get the class up and running. So this was another difference between the online class and the on-campus class. The on-campus class, you could just sort of roll right in and do it. Here, there's definitely more moving parts to get right. Not impossible by any stretch, but just the number of times before I had the checklist that I forgot to turn on all the lights, or check that the remote is working, or a set of things like that. So those were some examples. Now, a logical question to ask is, how did students receive this? And so here is some anecdotal feedback. This is feedback from the students' evaluation forms. I understand evaluation forms have their own biases and things, but at least my sense is that this is representative. And so these are examples to me of sort of representative positive feedback. And again, this is taken verbatim from these evaluations. The virtual classroom felt very personal. The mechanics of how the class is run should be a best practice. It was did a good job of it generating engagement. Technology was used better than in other classes. And I think for me, the last one is what I sort of am most excited about. That we made these topics accessible to all of us, regardless of the knowledge that we came in the course with. And again, this to me is really one of the main objectives we're trying to achieve when we're on campus, right? We're taking a very diverse set of students and getting them to develop a common framework for how to apply models. So, so to see that kind of feedback for the course, again, this doesn't mean this was true for all students, but I think for that student, that to me is a really exciting note. Not surprisingly, there also is constructive feedback on things that could be done better. And so the first is, the class sometimes became sidetracked with unimportant components. There could have been better time management, even though these were real world examples. Sometimes we got lost in the weeds. Now, to be honest, I get those exact same pieces of feedback when I teach on campus, right? And to me, that's the nature of case teaching. Like, again, what that shows to me is even in this format, while we had more guardrails, it wasn't like perfectly predictable. It wasn't perfectly linear. And because of that, sometimes you're going to slightly go off course. And, and again, some students like that more than others, and some students learn from it more than others. But it's a fact of how these kinds of courses are taught. So I actually, quite honestly, view those two as a feature, not a bug. That doesn't mean I don't need to do better in how I manage it, but to me, that wasn't the end of the world to get that feedback. The last one I think is slightly tougher, which is to say, hey, these cases weren't as stimulating as they would have been in person. Still a good job, but could have been better. And again, I think that's fair. What we've tried to show in the world of EdCraft is that on some dimensions, online teaching can surpass on-campus teaching. On other ones, I'd say at best we can do is get parity. And I hope that what this studio shows is that we can achieve parity. So what this is sort of yet another step in the world of EdCraft. I hope you choose to continue the journey through the links below.